Friends, our next scripture reading comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 16 through 23. Listen now for the word of the Lord. If I proclaim the gospel, this gives me no ground for boasting. For an obligation is laid on me, and woe to me if I do not proclaim the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a wage. But if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a commission. What then is my wage? Just this, that in my proclamation I may make the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my rights in the gospel. For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might gain all the more. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to gain Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might gain those that are under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, though I am not outside God's law, but am within Christ's law, so that I might gain those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, so that I might gain the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I might become a partner in it. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, today we begin the second part of our summer sermon series with the phrase, to be all things to all men. How many of you have heard this one before? All right, almost all of you. This phrase means to try to please everyone by appearing similar to them. Our book explains that in St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, he explains his tactics as an apostle. He has, he says, made himself a servant unto all, preaching to Jews. He acts as a Jew. Among the weak, he acts like someone who is weak. To them who are without law, as without law. So he tells his readers, I am made all things to all men, that I might save some. The approach clearly worked. I mean, no one could doubt St. Paul's success at spreading Christianity, but in modern English, this phrase, to be all things to all men, has come to describe a negative approach. It's an accusation often hurled at politicians. For example, that they will try to be all things to all men, and therefore have no substance of their own. In the words of another popular proverb, you can't please everyone. The example provided by our book, The Good Samaritan Bites the Dust, says, I know you want to be all things to all men, but wearing a Gryffindor tie with a Slytherin scarf isn't going to make you any friends. Oh, I'm so glad some of you got that. That's Harry Potter for some of my older friends out there. Now, when I first began my ministerial career, I was given a very valuable piece of advice by my colleague and mentor, the Reverend J. Sandiford. Now, I was, and still, as many of you have come to find out, I can be very socially awkward sometimes and a little bit anxious. And he told me to watch just enough news and read just a little bit on a wide variety of topics so that as a pastor, I could always find something to relate to in everyone. So I began practicing this. To relate to teenagers, for example, I bought myself a PlayStation 4 Pro, and I got all of the games that the kids were playing. And to relate to the older adults, I began to learn about the latest developments in healthcare and timeshares and stocks and bonds. To get along with parents, I began reading parenting blogs and asking them their thoughts on some of the more controversial parenting methods, like spanking, for example. And I got to learn about infant care. I hadn't even held a baby before I was an ordained minister. First time I baptized a kid, I was so nervous. And of course, they gave me the chunkiest baby. But the more that I learned, the more I realized how vastly different our lives truly are. Now, some people believe that by grasping onto the desires of others, we're not being true to ourselves. But I believe that through this practice, I actually found my truest self for the first time. You see, I got to break out of my smaller world and away from the things that I always knew and always enjoyed and considered quite safe. I got to try things that I had never tried before. I got to enjoy new foods that I never would have tasted as a younger person. And I even got to enjoy new types of television shows. Most recently, I've gotten into true crime. I've got dark circles, but if you like true crime, let's talk. Of course, the more that you learn, the less that you know. And it can be overwhelming to try to keep up with everything all the time. We cannot sustain the practice of being all things to all people. It's impossible. But you see, playing video games so that I could relate better to teenagers, I didn't do that so that I could become someone else or something else. It was not some fake effort to try to weasel my way into ministering amongst younger people. It was a way of learning how to fellowship with them in a manner that communicated that I'm genuinely interested in knowing what they're interested in. I genuinely care to get to know them by trying something new. And that's all that any of us wants, right? To not only be seen, but to be understood, to be accepted in this life. In 1520, reformer Martin Luther wrote a treatise called The Freedom of the Christian, and he began it with this paradox. A Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none. A Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all. And then he explained that these two theses seem to contradict each other, but both are Paul's own statements, who says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all." And in Romans chapter 13, verse 8, "Owe no one anything except to love one another." Our first duty is to God. And God asks us to love one another by way of genuine connection. It is connection that creates a community, and a loving connection that creates a bond. Now, as Christians, we are called to foster a community based on the love of God for one another. God did not make us to be people pleasers. And I'm going to say that twice for some of you. God did not create you to be a people pleaser, to always be what other people need you to be, and not who you need to be for yourself. We are not chameleons that can change our skin. We are not mythical Bogart creatures, for you Harry Potter fans, that can shapeshift into the desires or the fears of someone else. So often, if we are anything to another person, it could be that we are a disappointment, or maybe we're a hindrance to someone else, or an annoyance or a burden. Or maybe, just maybe, we are the only one who showed them care on a day that they needed care. And maybe we will never know it. And maybe that is our purpose in life. Maybe the purpose isn't some grand scheme. Maybe you were created for that one moment when someone else just needed to know that they were loved, and you said, "Hi, how are you?" Maybe that is why you were created. We are called to be all things loving all the time. Preacher and theologian Tony Campolo, and before I get into this, I should have warned you, so if you have to get up and excuse yourself, please know I will not be offended. I am about to speak of a willful choice to end one's life. So If that is difficult, I understand. Preacher and theologian Tony Campolo tells a troubling and sad story from his high school days of how he failed to truly be a Christian to another person. And it haunts him to this day that he was called to act and did not. There was a boy in his class that was named Roger, and Roger was not like the other boys because Roger was gay. And this was several decades ago when sexuality was misunderstood and intolerance seemed to be in fashion. Now, everyone knew Roger's sexuality, and they tormented him for it. They heaped verbal and even physical abuse upon him, and one day, the abuse reached a crescendo. 5 boys dragged Roger into the shower room at the gym at school, and they shoved him into a corner, and he cowered and he covered himself as the boys teased him and trapped him for their amusement. When he began to cry, they all took pleasure in it, and they took turns urinating on him. Tony heard about what had happened, and he did not stop it, and he did not speak to Roger about it. After all, they were just classmates. Around 2 o'clock the next morning, Roger went down to the basement of his house and he hung himself. When Tony heard about this, he says he realized that he hadn't behaved as a true Christian. He knew all the right answers. He sincerely believed all the right things, and he had lots of good and moral practices, but Tony didn't live faith out when it came to Roger. If he had, he says he would have stood up for Roger when the others were mocking him. He would have been a friend, and just maybe Roger would still be alive today. As I read this story about Tony Campolo, it reminded me of myself. One of my own dear high school friends suffered from depression. And we didn't know that he suffered from depression. He was quite private about it. He was in the marching band with me, and as band kids do, we all had our circles of friends. And we were in the same group of about 5 kids that would always hang out together. And he was also in my youth group at church. Chris was that kid that was just always nice. Whenever he noticed that somebody was left out, Chris would go over to them and ask them to come join us. Chris always noticed who was on the margins. And he was quite a catch, too. He was tall and he was blonde, and yeah, he had lots of teenage acne as well. And he didn't speak too much, but he would always be that good friend to that kid that needed that good friend. He would check on the kids who were less popular. He was just a really good guy, and he was a really good drummer, too. One day after band camp, Chris went home and shot himself. He was one of 3 of my high school friends in that small group that never made it to 21 years old. Chris's death destroyed us. I remember very clearly his memorial. My youth sponsor was there. We never had a youth pastor or a youth coordinator. We just had really good people that would volunteer their time. And we had this one guy named Gary, and Gary was a special child of God. He blamed himself for not doing more. He blamed himself for not seeing the signs. And quite frankly, we all blamed ourselves. But I remember at that memorial, I saw Gary standing there, and he was crying, and I went over to give him a hug. And I told him that there was nothing that we could have done, that we all loved Chris, but honestly, deep down, I carried that weight, that guilt that I told Gary not to have. I met up with a friend from that small group of friends from high school just 3 years ago. So here we are both in our 30s. We hadn't seen each other since the memorial, so it had been over 10 years. And we sat down to have a meal together, and he told me that each person in our little friend circle had fallen off the deep end after Chris. You see, the thing is, after that memorial, we didn't talk to each other anymore. One of them went off and clung to the bottle. Another started taking heroin. Another took ecstasy and lost himself at rave parties. And as my dear friend put it, then there was you, Emily. You clung to Jesus. And I did. It's true. Chris was a major part of why I became a pastor. I felt like I owed it to God to work off my debt for not being there for a friend in such dire need. I still carry that guilt, even though I know there was nothing I could have done if I had just called him or texted him, if I had just hugged him enough, just looked out for him the same way that he looked out for all of us. Maybe he'd still be here. If only I'd asked him to go out. We usually used to get root beer floats after band practice, and we didn't do it that day. If only, if only, if only. And so here I was saying to God, I will do anything to make up for this, because I know I can't fix it with Chris. But if I can't fix things for Chris, then I will be a friend, a mentor, an ally. I will be that safe space for as many people as I possibly can. Because you just don't know if a kind word or a smile from you is the thread that someone else could hang on to on a difficult day. To be all things is impossible, but to be all loving is our calling. In more modern terms, I believe that Paul meant that he finds common ground with all men because he has compassion for all men. As servants to God and to one another, we are called into moments of selflessness, moments to listen, to be present for another person, to give, and even moments to receive. We are called to love one another as Christ loves us. And when we can look across the room at the person that we loathe the most in this world and still find beauty in them, value, if we can give empathy to them, that is to find common ground in being alive and understanding that being alive comes with pain and joy and anger and love that forges us all into the people that we will become and the ways that we choose to act and react throughout our life's journeys. That is what it is to love our neighbor. But Jesus, who is my neighbor? Your neighbor is the teenager with teenage acne. Your neighbor is the single mom on food stamps. Your neighbor is that shiny, suited-up lawyer or that politician that you really can't stand listening to on the television. Your neighbor is the janitor or the homeless man down on 6th Street. Your neighbor is the drag queen, the neo-Nazi, the grumpy war vet, and the trad wife. To be human is hard enough with all the love in the world. But to be human without a friend to count on, a person who supports you or believes in you, to be in this life without being seen, accepted, and valued, that is hell. To walk around knowing that nobody cares about you. That's hell. Withholding love from another person is to create a hell. Look out for the kind ones. They are most often kind because they know what it is to receive unkindness. To be all things to all men is to be all human, all loving, all genuine. It will not fix the world, but it can save the few, and each one is priceless. Amen.